do the first 4 or 5. We're going to kind of skip around a little bit because the cranial nerves go into and out of the brain stem. That's why they're called cranial, because it's part of the brain. All right. Well, we ought to look at the brain stem first. So in your lecture notes, this starts on page 94. 96 is the actual words. I'm not going to hold you responsible just yet for everything that's listed on the structures, because part of them are cranial nerves and part of them have to do with pathways that we're talking about on Friday and Monday. I'm going to show you some of those pathways in lecture today. They involve diagrams that look like this, all right? So Friday and Monday is when we actually put all this stuff together, and we see how the thalamus and the precentral gyrus and the medial lemniscus and this kind of stuff we haven't even talked about yet work together in a pathway. It's actually my favorite lecture components of this whole, because you're finally able to see how some of all of these disparate structures actually work together. So it's on the list of components of the brainstem, and I will illustrate them to you, but don't expect, again, to fully understand them until we actually do those pathways. And then lab today is the sheep brain. So we're going to do that first, and then you'll have about 30 to 45 minutes to study for the quiz. And we'll have the quiz towards the end of lab, all right? So you have more opportunity to kind of put these components together, because it'll involve structures that we've been working, the basal nuclei that we're putting together.
Today modeling, Thursday's sheep brain.
Today's modeling.
Okay, you said sheep.
Did I say sheep brain? I'm sorry. Today's modeling. Yeah. Today's modeling. Thursday's
freaking out, Mom. Nobody's
the section. Yeah. I mean, that's what we did in the
Actually prepared.
the modeling. All right. So the medulla oblongata is the inferior portion of the brainstem. So we go back to this picture. Right here would be the midbrain, and that's part of the hypothalamus. So hypothalamus is fitting into this area right here, and then we start midbrain, pons, and medulla. Or if we're doing sensory, we start medulla, pons, and midbrain. All right. So sensory fibers are going to be going up. Motor projection fibers are going to be going down. And to try to understand how these blend together, we're going to be talking back and forth about some of the components. So here we're looking as the spinal cord transitions to the medulla. That happens at the foramen magnum, and it's not just we're outside the brain, it's spinal cord, we're inside the skull, it's brain, it's medulla. All right, if you actually section through the medulla, a cross section, it looks different. The gray matter and white matter are organized differently. And so that is the structure associated with the neuroembryological vesicles. So last week we talked about the prosencephalon becoming the telencephalon, and we talked about the cerebral lobes and the basal nuclei. And then Friday we completed that with the diencephalon and talked about thalamus and hypothalamus and mentioned the pineal gland. So that was prosencephalon components. What were the 3 early vesicles that the neurotube develops into? Prosencephalon was the most anterior, and then we have the other 2, mesencephalon and rhombencephalon, and that's what we're finishing up today. So mesencephalon doesn't change much, and it's going to differentiate into the midbrain. And what part of the ventricular system do we associate with the midbrain? It looks the most like the central canal. Yes, the cerebral aqueduct. Now our rhombencephalon further divides into 2 vesicles. So these are going to be the metencephalon and myelencephalon. And the metencephalon will form the pons, and the cerebellum. So over the roof of the fourth ventricle, it will give rise to the cerebellum. And then the myelencephalon will form the medulla oblongata. And ventricular system associated with these two? Fourth ventricle. So the fourth ventricle this is a narrow structure for the cerebral aqueduct. And then with the flexure of the rhombencephalon, it widens the fourth ventricle and it forms this diamond-shaped structure. All right? So the upper portion is going to be associated with the pons. It's going to form the floor of the fourth upper portion will be the pons. And this portion will be the medulla. So the medulla has two parts. If we section the upper part of the medulla, we see the fourth ventricle as a wide structure. If we section the lower part of the medulla, it's more like the central canal. Okay? And so this is the fourth ventricle. So we're going to start with the medulla, the lower portion. And again, we have ventral and posterior structures of the medulla. Right? So ventral structures, this is ventral brainstem right here. Again, if you guys want to get the brains out and look at the brainstem on here or the brainstem models, you're welcome to. I have some images of the brainstem models on here as well. So here's the mammillary body, pituitary gland of the hypothalamus, and then we have midbrain, pons, and medulla. All right. So ventral structures are primarily responsible for what type of function? Sensory or motor? Motor. Okay. So remember the upper motor neuron? What lobe is the site of the upper motor neuron when I'm going to do voluntary movement? The frontal lobe. And the gyrus? Precentral gyrus. All right. So those fibers, what type of fibers are they? That are going down the spinal cord to the anterior gray horn? Projection fibers. All right. So here would be an upper motor neuron, and it's going to come down and form midbrain structures that we'll come back to and talk about. So give me a chance to draw these, and then I'll label structures for you. So I'm trying to help put things together here some more. So we would have precentral gyrus. Would be the source of our upper motor neurons. And then here we're seeing these motor fibers coming through the midbrain. Through the pons. And then as they continue through the pons, they form two columns of motor fibers on the ventral surface of the medulla. Known as the medullary pyramids. All right, so this whole structure is the medulla oblongata, and this structure right here is known as a medullary pyramid. Okay. Near the bottom part of the pyramids, these motor fibers are going to cross over and travel in the opposite side of the spinal cord. So this bottom portion here is known as the pyramidal decussation, which means crossing over.
Does that crossing happen in the pyramidal?
It happens in the lower portion, so in this image, it's right here.
Is that D-E?
A D-A-L, pyramidal. There's the illustrator. And that's the crossing over of those motor fibers. So it's kind of right near the bottom portion of the pyramids. So now if we turn and look at the dorsal view, what we're going to see primarily is the fourth ventricle. So this portion of the fourth ventricle is going to belong to the medulla. And then I'm going to draw a cross-section of the medulla and look at some of the gray matter and how it looks as a cross-section. So before we get to that, here's a diagram showing the thalamus. Okay, here's the optic nerves tract going back to the thalamus. And here are motor fibers coming through the midbrain, coming through the pons, and forming these medullary pyramids. On our model, on the brainstem model, those of you that have the brainstem models, here would be, again, the optic nerve and mammillary bodies of the hypothalamus. And here would be the optic tract going back to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. Motor fibers coming through the midbrain, the pons, and here would be the medullary pyramids, right here. Okay, ventral view. Lateral view, can't see much difference. Posterior view, here would be the fourth ventricle. This part would be in the medulla, and then the posterior aspect of the medulla. Okay. I'll talk about the inferior cerebellar peduncles in just a second. So now I want to look at a cross-section, a transverse section of the medulla. This is taken a little bit higher up where we can still see the fourth ventricle. I'm going to draw one that's kind of in between. And so here would be the opening of the fourth ventricle. So these would be the two medullary pyramids. So this would be ventral. And the pyramids, the motor fibers have been cut in cross section, so we're just looking at descending motor fibers. All right. It's very even here, but anyway. Then we have ascending motor fibers that are coming from your joints. Remember the posterior white column? The posterior white column is going to carry joint sense fibers all the way up to your cortex. But we have other joint fibers that are coming up and going to the cerebellum. So they're going to go to the cerebellum through a bridge-like structure from this area. So these are, let me change the color. These are sensory. Sorry, guys. So these are joint senses that are not going to the brain, but to the cerebellum. We'll talk about this pathway on Friday. And they form a bridge to the cerebellum known as the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So that would be this area right here. Fibers going out to the cerebellum. All right. In addition, and it's not shown here because it's at a level slightly lower than what I have, but we're going to kind of compress them all together. There are two nuclei located here that are involved in that dorsal column pathway. We're going to talk about that pathway on Friday. So if it seems a little vague here, that's fine, because we're going to go over it in detail on Friday, but I want to show it to you here. So this is what we're doing on Friday, is looking at a series and drawing the neurons. So just put your pen down and listen. You don't have to write this stuff down. We're going to do it on Friday. In a sensory pathway, okay, that's going all the way for processing by primary auditory cortex or primary sensory cortex or primary visual cortex, we have 3 neurons. And I'll be saying this at the beginning of Friday's lecture. The first neuron is coming into the spinal cord or into the brainstem. Its cell body is going to form the dorsal root ganglion. Okay? And then normally we talked about for pain, touch, and temperature, it's stopped in the posterior gray horn. And then the next neuron is going to cross over and go up in the spinal column. But for our dorsal posterior white column pathway, do you remember what kind of information that carried? Again, if you don't, we're going to talk about it on Friday. That was the processing of joint sense, proprioception, knowing whether my fingers are flexed or extended. All right, so that pathway, the sensory neuron comes through the dorsal root ganglion, goes into the posterior white column, but it doesn't stop. That same neuron is going to go all the way up the spinal cord in the posterior white column. This is the one where that woman had a virus that destroyed it and she couldn't walk without looking at her actual limbs. So that posterior white column goes all the way up through the back of the spinal cord and to one of these 2 nuclei in the medulla. And all second neurons cross. So usually they cross in the spinal cord, but in this case our first neuron went all the way up to the medulla, and that's where it stops. So the nucleus cuneatus and gracilis are formed of the cell bodies of this second sensory neuron. It crosses and it goes up through the pons and midbrain to the thalamus. And remember, the thalamus is made up of all third order neurons. And that's going to take it to the postcentral gyrus where it's processed so I know whether my fingers are flexed or extended. All right, so that's what I have drawn over here are these 2 groups of cell bodies. And these are the equivalent of our posterior gray horn for pain, touch, and temperature processing in the spinal cord. But for joint sense, it's up in the medulla. So that first neuron has come all the way up the spinal cord. And it's going to synapse in the nucleus cuneatus or gracilis. So these are our cell bodies. And their neuron is going to cross over and then go up to the brain. All right? So nucleus cuneatus or gracilis. An I or a U back there is fast. So cuneatus is information coming in from your arms and upper extremities. Gracilis is coming from your lower extremities. Okay? You don't need to know whether this is gracilis and that's cuneatus or vice versa. Just recognize that it's the cuneatus and the gracilis nuclei. And we'll work with those on Friday when we do this pathway. Notice its position in the midbrain, in the medulla. Are these sensory or motor pathways? Sensory, it's joint sense. Notice where they are? in the posterior aspect of the medulla. Our descending motor fibers are in the ventral or anterior aspect of the medulla. Okay, so we're still keeping that same relationship of anterior structures being motor and posterior structures being sensory. Okay? All right.